In the sweltering summer of 1874, Alabama lay under a heavy pall, its air thick with the lingering ghosts of the Civil War. Nearly a decade had passed since the Confederacy's surrender, but the wounds of that brutal conflict festered still, raw and unhealed. Reconstruction had swept through the South like a tempest, upending the old order and leaving a fractured society in its wake. The once mighty planter aristocracy clung to their crumbling estates, their fortunes eroded by war and emancipation. Racial tensions simmered, a volatile undercurrent that pulsed through every town and hamlet. Old grudges born of blood and betrayal hung over the land like a storm waiting to break. Amid this uneasy landscape stood Holloway Plantation, a decaying monument to a bygone era, its sprawling fields and sagging structures shrouded in whispers of dread. Nestled in the heart of Lowndes County, the plantation was a world unto itself, isolated from the nearest town by miles of red clay roads and dense pine forests. Once a thriving empire built on the backs of enslaved men and women, its cotton fields had stretched as far as the eye could see, their white bolls gleaming under the Alabama sun. The Holloway family, led by the iron-willed patriarch Elias Holloway, had reigned supreme, their wealth and influence rivaling any in the state. But by 1874, the plantation was a shadow of its former glory. The fields lay fallow, choked with weeds and neglect. The grand main house, with its towering columns and wide verandas, sagged under the weight of time, its white paint peeling like dead skin. The slave quarters, long abandoned, stood in eerie silence, their rotting timbers sinking into the earth. Yet, despite its decay, Holloway Plantation remained a place of fascination and fear. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, their voices dropping to whispers when the name Holloway crossed their lips. They told of strange lights flickering in the fields long after midnight, pale and unnatural, like will-o'-the-wisps luring the unwary to their doom. They spoke of cries that echoed from the dark, not quite human, rising and falling with the wind. Some swore they had heard the clank of chains dragging through the empty halls of the main house, though no living soul had set foot there in years. Most chilling of all was the talk of a curse, a malevolent force that clung to the land like a sickness, poisoning all who dared to linger. It was said that the very soil was tainted, soaked in the blood and suffering of those who had toiled and died under the Holloway yoke. No one could say for certain when the curse began, but all agreed it was real, and it was hungry. The plantation's isolation only fueled the story. The nearest town, Hayneville, was a good 10 miles away, a sleepy cluster of clapboard shops and modest homes, where the war's aftermath had left deep scars. Freedmen and former planters eyed each other warily, their uneasy coexistence marked by suspicion and resentment. The town's elders, those who remembered the plantation in its prime, warned their children to steer clear of the Holloway land. "Ain't nothing good there," they'd say, their faces grim. "That place is cursed, and it don't care who it take." Children, emboldened by curiosity, sometimes dared each other to venture near the plantation's borders, but few crossed the rusted iron gates that marked its entrance. Those who did returned with tales of an oppressive weight in the air, a feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. The landscape itself seemed to conspire in the plantation's eerie reputation. The fields, once meticulously tended, had grown wild and tangled, their edges swallowed by thickets of briars and gnarled oaks draped in Spanish moss. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, a cloying sweetness that lingered in the throat. A sluggish creek, its waters stained a murky red from the clay, wound through the property, its banks lined with cypress trees, whose roots twisted like skeletal fingers. At night the plantation was cloaked in an unnatural stillness, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves stirred by no discernible breeze. Even the wildlife seemed to shun the place. Birds rarely sang within its boundaries, and the deer that roamed the surrounding forests gave the fields a wide berth. The main house, though crumbling, still dominated the landscape, its silhouette stark against the horizon. Built in the Greek Revival style, it had once been a symbol of the Holloway family's power, its grand facade a testament to their wealth. Now its windows were dark, some boarded up, others staring blankly like empty eyes. The wide front porch, where Elias Holloway had once held court, sagged under the weight of years, its floorboards warped and splintered. Ivy crept up the walls, its tendrils prying into cracks in the brick. as if nature itself sought to reclaim the house. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint, sour smell of mildew. The grand staircase, once polished to a gleam, creaked ominously underfoot, and the chandeliers hung lifeless, their crystals dulled by grime. Yet, despite its ruin, the house seemed alive in a way that chilled the blood, a presence that lingered in the shadows, watching, waiting. The slave quarters, a grim counterpoint to the main house, stood in a cluster at the edge of the field. Their wooden walls had weathered to a sickly grey, and many had collapsed entirely, leaving only heaps of splintered boards and rusted nails. The quarters had housed dozens of enslaved families, their lives bound to the land and the Holloway's way. The suffering that had taken place there left an indelible mark, a heaviness that seemed to seep from the ground itself. Locals whispered that the spirits of those who had died in bondage still lingered, their anguish woven into the fabric of the plantation. Some claimed to have seen figures moving among the ruins at dusk, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human, their eyes hollow with unspoken grief. Beyond the physical decay, there was something intangible about Holloway Plantation that set it apart from other abandoned estates. It was as if the land itself held a grudge, a deep and abiding malice that defied explanation. Those who ventured too close spoke of a sudden chill, even in the heat of summer, and a sense of dread that settled in their bones. Some reported hearing their own names whispered in the wind, though no one was there. Others described a feeling of being followed, the sensation of footsteps pacing just behind them, only to turn and find nothing but empty air. The stories varied, but they all carried the same warning. Holloway Plantation was not a place for the living. The plantation's reputation extended beyond Lowndes County, drawing the curious and the foolhardy from across Alabama, and even farther afield. Journalists from Montgomery and Mobile penned lurid articles about the haunted Holloway estate, embellishing the tales with Gothic flair. Spiritualists and mediums, eager to make a name for themselves, held seances on the grounds, claiming to commune with restless spirits. Most left shaken, their instruments shattered or their nerve broken. Even skeptics, those who scoffed at talk of curses and ghosts, admitted to an unease they could not explain. A surveyor from Birmingham, hired in 1873 to assess the land for sale, abandoned the job after a single day, refusing to speak of what he had seen. "That place ain't right," he told the local magistrate, his hands trembling. "It ain't meant to be." The Holloway family, though long gone from the plantation, cast a long shadow over its legacy. Elias Holloway had been a man of contradictions, devoutly religious in public, yet ruthless in his dealings. His sons, Silas and Jeremiah, had inherited his ambition but none of his restraint. Whispers of their cruelty had spread even during the plantation's heyday, tales of punishments meted out in the fields and secrets buried beneath the soil. By 1874, both sons were dead, and the family's name was synonymous with tragedy. Yet their story was far from over, for the curse that plagued the plantation seemed to follow the Holloway bloodline, a dark thread woven through the generations. The surrounding community too bore the weight of the plantation's presence. Farmers whose lands bordered the Holloway estate complained of blighted crops and sickly livestock, blaming the curse for their misfortunes. Preachers in Hayneville's churches warned their congregations against venturing near the plantation, citing it as a place where the devil held sway. Even the freedmen, many of whom had once labored on the Holloway land, spoke of it with a mix of fear and reverence, their oral traditions preserving stories of resistance and retribution. Among them the name Maria was spoken with a quiet awe, her role in the curse a matter of both pride and terror. As the summer of 1874 gave way to autumn, the plantation seemed to grow darker, its aura more oppressive. The days shortened, and the nights carried a chill that seemed to emanate from the land itself. Those who passed by on the road reported seeing shapes moving in the fields too tall and too swift to be human. The great oak near the main house, where Maria had been hanged, stood as a grim sentinel, its branches gnarled and bare. Some swore they saw it sway on windless nights, as if stirred by an unseen hand. The plantation, it seemed, was not content to fade into obscurity. It demanded to be remembered, its story etched in fear and shadow. In this haunted corner of Alabama, where the past refused to stay buried, Holloway Plantation stood as a testament to the sins of its makers. Its fields, its house, its very air pulsed with a malevolence that defied reason, a curse that bound the land and its people in an endless cycle of suffering. As the years wore on, the stories would only grow, each generation adding its own chapter to the plantation's grim legacy. But in 1874, as the South grappled with its own demons, Holloway Plantation was already a place apart, a realm where the living tread lightly, and the dead held court in the dark. In the annals of Alabama's antebellum history, few names carried the weight of the Holloways. By the mid-19th century, they were a dynasty that commanded both awe and fear, their wealth built on the sprawling cotton fields of Holloway Plantation and the suffering of those who toiled there. At the heart of this empire stood Elias Holloway, a man whose iron will and unrelenting ambition had forged a fortune from the red clay of Lowndes County. His legacy, however, was not one of triumph but of darkness, a tangled web of cruelty, greed and whispered pacts that would stain the Holloway name for generations. By 1874, with the plantation crumbling and the family scattered, the Holloways were spoken of in hushed tones, their story a cautionary tale of hubris and retribution. Elias Holloway was born in 1798 to a modest farming family in Georgia, but his ambition far outstripped his humble beginnings. By the age of 30, he had acquired a tract of land in Alabama's Black Belt, a region renowned for its fertile soil and brutal plantations. Through cunning, ruthlessness and an uncanny knack for bending others to his will, Elias transformed that land into Holloway Plantation, a sprawling estate that produced cotton at a scale that rivaled the grandest plantations in the South. His success was not merely a matter of business acumen. Elias was a man who thrived on control. Tall and gaunt, with piercing grey eyes and a voice that could cut through a room, he was a figure of almost biblical authority. In public, he played the part of a devout Christian, quoting scripture and donating generously to the local church. But behind closed doors, he was a tyrant, his temper as volatile as a summer storm. The plantation's prosperity came at a steep human cost. By the 1840s, Holloway Plantation was home to over 200 enslaved men, women and children, their lives governed by Elias's unrelenting demands. He was known for his brutal punishments. Whippings, brandings and worse were meted out for the slightest infraction. Stories circulated of men worked to death in the fields, of women subjected to unspeakable cruelties, of children sold away from their families to settle debts or curry favor. Elias's overseers, handpicked for their loyalty and cruelty, ensured that no one escaped his wrath. Yet, despite the horrors, Elias's wealth grew, his cotton fetching top prices in markets from Mobile to Liverpool. To the outside world, he was a pillar of Southern society, a man who had tamed the wilderness and built an empire. To those who knew him best, he was a devil in human form. Elias's sons, Silas and Jeremiah, were cut from the same unforgiving cloth. Born in 1825 and 1828 respectively, they grew up in the shadow of their father's ambition, groomed to inherit his empire and his ruthlessness. Silas, the elder, was a brooding figure, his handsome features marred by a perpetual scowl. He lacked his father's charisma but matched his cruelty, delighting in the power he wielded over the enslaved. Jeremiah, by contrast, was quieter, almost scholarly, with a penchant for books and an unsettling fascination with the occult. While Silas enforced discipline in the fields, Jeremiah was often found in the plantation's library, poring over tomes of folklore and esoteric knowledge. Together, they were a formidable pair, their combined influence ensuring that the Holloway name remained synonymous with fear. By the 1850s, whispers began to circulate about the Holloway brothers' darker pursuit. Locals spoke of strange gatherings in the woods beyond the plantation, held under the light of the full moon. Flickering torches and eerie chants were said to drift through the night air, accompanied by the faint smell of burning herbs. Some claimed the brothers performed rituals to ensure the plantation's continued prosperity, offerings of blood and bone to appease forces older than the land itself. Others whispered of pacts made with entities best left undisturbed, deals that promised wealth and power in exchange for unspeakable sacrifices. These stories were dismissed as superstition by some, but those who worked the plantation's fields knew better. They spoke of nights when the air grew heavy, when shadows moved without a source, when the very earth seemed to pulse with a malevolent life. Elias, for his part, did little to discourage these rumors. If anything, he seemed to relish the fear they inspired. He was a man who understood the power of myth, and he wielded it as deftly as he did his whip. To his neighbors he presented himself as a pragmatic businessman, but there was no denying the unease that followed. His rare appearances in Hayneville were marked by averted gazes and hurried whispers. Merchants who dealt with him spoke of a man who seemed to see too much, his grey eyes boring into their soul. Even the local preacher, a fire and brimstone Baptist who feared no man, hesitated to speak out against Elias, as if sensing something unholy in his presence. The Civil War brought upheaval to Holloway Plantation, as it did to the entire South. With the Union's victory and the abolition of slavery, the plantation's labor force was freed, and its economic foundation crumbled. Elias, now in his 60s, watched his empire erode with a bitterness that bordered on madness. He refused to adapt, clinging to the old ways even as his fields lay fallow and his debts mounted. Silas and Jeremiah, meanwhile, struggled to maintain control. Silas took to drinking heavily, his temper growing more volatile with each passing year. Jeremiah retreated further into his studies, his obsession with the occult deepening. By the time Elias died in 1867, reportedly of a heart attack in the main house's study, the Holloway family was a shadow of its former self. Elias's death did not bring peace to the plantation. If anything, it marked the beginning of a darker chapter. Silas, now the head of the family, ruled with a cruelty that surpassed even his father's. He was convinced that the plantation's decline was the result of betrayal by the freedmen, by his neighbors, by the world itself. His paranoia grew, and he became obsessed with reclaiming the plantation's former glory. Jeremiah, meanwhile, withdrew almost entirely, spending his days locked in the library or wandering the fields at night. Those who saw him spoke of a man changed, his eyes hollow, his voice barely above a whisper. Some said he was searching for a way to break the curse that had begun to take hold, while others believed he was deepening it, feeding the darkness that clung to the land. The rumors of the brothers' involvement in dark rituals gained new life after Elias's death. A freedman who had once worked the plantation claimed to have seen Silas and Jeremiah in the woods, standing over a crude altar stained with blood. He spoke of symbols carved into the earth, of words that made his skin crawl, of a presence that seemed to watch from the shadows. The story spread, and soon the plantation was shunned by all but the most desperate. Workers refused to set foot on the land, and merchants stopped delivering goods. The Holloways, once the lords of Lowndes County, were now pariahs, their names synonymous with a darkness that could not be explained. Silas's death in 1870 was the first true sign that something was terribly wrong. Found in his study, his body slumped over a desk littered with papers. He was said to have died of fright, his face frozen in a mask of terror. No marks were found on his body, no poison in his blood, yet the room reeked of something acrid and unnatural. Jeremiah, who discovered his brother, refused to speak of what he had seen, but those who glimpsed him in the days that followed noted a feverish intensity in his eye. He died 2 years later, his body found at the foot of the great oak near the main house, the same tree where Mariah had been hanged. His death was ruled a suicide, but the rope around his neck was frayed, as if something had pulled at it with inhuman strength. By 1874, the Holloway family was all but extinct, their plantation a decaying relic avoided by all. Yet their legacy endured, woven into the stories told around hearths and in churchyards. The Holloways had built an empire on blood and suffering, and in doing so they had sown the seeds of their own destruction, whether it was a curse, as the locals believed, or simply the weight of their sins. The Holloway name carried a stain that could not be washed away. The plantation, with its sagging house and haunted fields, stood as a monument to their hubris, a place where the past refused to die, and the darkness they had summoned still lingered, waiting for its next victim.
The curse that gripped Holloway Plantation was a shadow cast long before the summer of 1874, its roots tangled in the blood-soaked soil of Alabama's antebellum past. While the plantation's decay and the Holloway family's downfall were plain to see, the true origin of the curse remained shrouded in mystery, a tale whispered in fragments by those who dared speak of it. At the heart of these stories stood Mariah, an enslaved woman whose life and death would bind the land to a darkness that refused to fade. Her story, pieced together from oral traditions, fragmented records, and the fearful murmurs of Lowndes County, was one of resilience, defiance, and a vengeance that seemed to transcend the grave. Mariah was born on Holloway Plantation around 1820, though no record marked her exact birth. She was the daughter of an enslaved healer, a woman known only as Mama Zora, whose knowledge of herbs and African spiritual practices had been passed down through generations. Mariah inherited her mother's gifts, learning to blend roots and leaves into remedies that could soothe fevers, mend wounds, or ease the pain of childbirth. By her 20s, she was a figure of quiet authority among the enslaved, her small cabin in the quarters a place where the sick sought healing and the desperate sought hope. Her presence was a subtle rebellion against the brutality of the Holloway regime, a flicker of light in a world of suffering. Yet her knowledge made her a target. For the Holloways, Elias and his sons, Silas and Jeremiah, viewed her abilities with a mix of suspicion and fear. Mariah's reputation extended beyond the plantation. Freedmen and poor whites from nearby farms would slip through the woods to seek her aid, bringing offerings of food or cloth in exchange for her remedies. She was said to have a way of seeing into people, her dark eyes reading truths they could not hide. Some whispered that her gifts went beyond herbs, that she could commune with spirits, read omens in the stars, or ward off evil with charms woven from straw and bone. These stories, though dismissed by the plantation's overseers as superstition, unnerved the Holloway. Elias, in particular, saw Mariah's influence as a threat to his control, a challenge to the divine order he believed justified his rule. Silas, his eldest son, was more direct in his hatred, viewing her as a symbol of resistance that needed to be crushed. The events that led to Mariah's death unfolded in the spring of 1860, a year when the plantation was at the height of its prosperity. Silas's only son, a frail boy named Thomas, fell ill with a fever that no doctor in Hayneville could cure. The boy's condition worsened, his small body racked with convulsions, and the Holloway household descended into chaos. Silas, desperate and enraged, turned his suspicions on Mariah. Rumors had long circulated that she could wield her knowledge for harm as well as healing, and Silas became convinced she had poisoned his son out of spite. The accusation was baseless. Mariah had never been allowed near the boy, but truth mattered little to a man like Silas. He saw in Mariah a scapegoat for his fears, a way to assert his dominance over a world slipping from his grasp. On a moonless night in April, Silas and a group of overseers dragged Mariah from her cabin. The enslaved community watched in helpless terror as she was bound and taken to the great oak near the main house, a towering tree that had stood witness to countless cruelties. A noose was fashioned, and Silas himself tightened it around her neck. Mariah, it was said, did not beg or weep. Instead, she stood tall, her eyes locked on Silas with a defiance that chilled those who saw it. As the rope was pulled taut, she spoke words that would echo through the years. "This land will never know peace," she declared, her voice steady despite the noose. "Your blood will pay for mine, and the earth will drink your sins." Some swore the air grew heavy as she spoke. The wind stilled and a shadow seemed to pass over the moon. Then, with a brutal yank, she was gone, her body swaying in the night air. Thomas died 2 days later, his fever unbroken. The Holloways buried him in the family plot, a small grave marked with a marble angel, but the plantation was never the same. Almost immediately, strange occurrences began to plague the estate. Crops that had flourished for years withered overnight, their roots blackened as if burned. Livestock fell ill, their bodies wasting away despite ample feed. Workers reported seeing lights flickering in the fields, pale and cold, moving without a soul. The great oak where Mariah had been hanged became a place of dread. Its leaves turned brittle, and its bark seemed to weep a dark, sticky. The enslaved whispered among themselves that Mariah's spirit had not left, that her curse had taken root in the soil itself, a vengeance that would outlast them all. Silas dismissed the talk of curses, attributing the plantation's troubles to poor weather or lazy work, but the unease in his eyes betrayed his bravado. He began to drink heavily, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. Jeremiah, his younger brother, was less dismissive. His obsession with the occult led him to study Mariah's death, poring over her few belongings, a handful of herbs, a carved wooden charm, a scrap of cloth stained with strange symbols. He became convinced that her curse was real, that her words had awakened something ancient and malevolent. In secret, he attempted rituals to appease or banish it, but his efforts only seemed to deepen the darkness. The plantation's overseers, hardened men accustomed to violence, began to avoid the fields at night, muttering about shadows that moved against the wind. The Civil War and the end of slavery brought further chaos to Holloway Plantation, but the curse showed no signs of abating. Freedmen who had once worked the land refused to return, even when offered wage. Those who stayed spoke of hearing Mariah's voice in the wind, a low, mournful chant that carried her final words. The main house, once a symbol of Holloway power, became a place of dread. Servants reported hearing footsteps in empty rooms, doors slamming shut on their own, and a faint, rhythmic sound like chains dragging across the floor. Elias, still alive at the time, grew increasingly erratic, his sermons about divine retribution tinged with a fear he could not name. When he died in 1867, slumped over his desk with a look of horror frozen on his face, many believed Mariah's curse had claimed its first Holloway. Silas's death in 1870 cemented the curse's hold on the family. Found in his study, his body rigid and his eyes wide with terror, he bore no marks of violence, yet the air around him was thick with a foul, unplaceable odor. The room's windows were shattered, though no storm had passed that night. Jeremiah, who found his brother, refused to speak of the scene, but his behavior grew stranger still. He was seen wandering the fields at dusk, muttering to himself, his hands clutching the wooden charm he had taken from Mariah's cabin. His own death in 1872, beneath the same oak where Mariah had been hanged, was ruled a suicide, but the frayed rope and the unnatural angle of his neck suggested something far worse. By 1874, the curse was no longer a mere whisper but a truth acknowledged by all who knew the Holloway name. The plantation stood abandoned, its fields choked with weeds, its house a hollow shell. Yet Mariah's presence lingered, her story woven into the fabric of Lowndes County. The freedmen who had known her passed down tales of her strength and her vengeance, their voices tinged with both pride and fear. They spoke of the great oak as Mariah's tree, a place where the veil between worlds was Some claimed to see her there at midnight, her form shimmering in the moonlight, her eyes burning with a fire that promised retribution. Others said her spirit walked the fields, her footsteps leaving no trace but stirring the air with a chill that pierced the bird. The curse's origins, though centered on Mariah, were more than the work of one woman's dying words. The Holloway's sins, generations of cruelty, exploitation and unholy ambition, had created a debt that the land itself seemed determined to collect. Mariah's death was the spark, her curse the vessel, but the darkness that gripped the plantation felt older, deeper, as if the earth had been waiting for a reason to unleash its wrath. Whether it was her spirit, the spirits of countless others who had suffered under the Holloway yoke, or something altogether more ancient, the curse was real. It bound the plantation and its heirs in a cycle of suffering, a reckoning that showed no signs of ending. As the summer of
By the 1880s, Holloway Plantation had become a shadow of its former self, a sprawling relic of a once thriving empire now crumbling under the weight of its own dark history. The fields, once lush with cotton and tobacco, lay fallow, choked with weeds and thorny vines that seemed to twist into unnatural shapes under the moonlight. The grand manor house, with its peeling paint and sagging verandas, stood like a hollowed-out husk, its windows dark and staring like empty eyes. The few who remained, stubborn tenant farmers, desperate squatters, or those too poor to leave, spoke in hushed tones of things that could not be explained, of a malevolence that seemed to seep from the very soil. The plantation was no longer a place of labor or profit. It had become a place of fear, where the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin, and the air was thick with the residue of something ancient and vengeful. The first whispers of unearthly events began in the winter of 1881, when a bitter frost gripped the land, turning the ground hard as iron. A tenant farmer named Ezekiel Tate, a wiry man known for his stoic disposition, was the first to speak openly of the shadows. He claimed to have seen them while tending to a broken fence near the northern boundary of the plantation, where the fields gave way to a dense thicket of gnarled oaks. The figures, he said, were not human. At least, not entire. They were tall and gaunt, their forms indistinct, as if woven from the darkness itself. They moved silently through the fields, their outlines flickering like candle flames caught in a draught. Ezekiel swore they watched him, their presence heavy with intent, though he could never make out their faces. When he returned the next day, the fence he had mended was torn apart, the wooden posts snapped like kindling, and the ground was marked with deep, claw-like gashes that no animal could have made. Word of Ezekiel's encounter spread quickly among the remaining workers, igniting a firestorm of fear. Many had already felt an unease they could not name, a prickling at the back of the neck, a sudden chill in rooms that should have been warm, or the sensation of being followed when no one was there. But Ezekiel's tale gave form to their dread, and soon others began to come forward with their own stories. A washerwoman named Clara, who lived in a shack near the old slave quarters, spoke of hearing wails in the dead of night, high, keening cries that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She described them as the sounds of a woman in torment, her voice rising and falling like a storm wind, sometimes so close it seemed she was standing just outside the door.
Clara would bar her windows and pray until dawn, but the cries never stopped, and sometimes she said they called her name. The sound of chains became another recurring terror. Workers reported hearing them dragging across the floors of the empty manor house, a slow, deliberate scrape that echoed through the halls long after the last Holloway had left. One man, a drifter named Amos, who had taken shelter in the overseer's cabin, swore he saw the source of the sound one moonless night. He described a figure standing in the doorway of the cabin, its silhouette framed by the faint glow of starlight. It was tall, he said, and draped in tattered cloth, its head bowed as if in sorrow. In its hands it held a length of chain, rusted and heavy, which it dragged slowly across the floorboards. Amos fled, leaving his belongings behind, and refused to return, even in daylight. When others went to investigate, they found the cabin empty, but the floor was scored with long, jagged marks, as if something had been dragged across it with terrible force. The hanging tree, an ancient oak that stood at the edge of the plantation, became the focal point of the most chilling tales. It was here, legend held, that Maria, the enslaved woman who had cursed the Holloways, had been executed decades earlier. Her story had been passed down in whispers, a tale of defiance and retribution that grew more potent with each telling. By the 1880s, the tree was a gnarled, twisted thing, its branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Locals swore that on certain nights when the moon was full and the air was still, Maria's ghost could be seen beneath it. Her form was described as both beautiful and terrifying, her body clad in a tattered white dress, her face obscured by shadow except for her eyes, which burned with a fire that seemed to pierce the soul. Those who saw her claimed she did not speak, but her presence was a weight, a promise of vengeance that left witnesses trembling and sleepless for days. One such witness was a young girl named Sarah, the daughter of a sharecropper who had taken up residence in one of the crumbling tenant houses. Sarah was a quiet child, given to wandering the fields alone, her curiosity undeterred by the stories that kept others indoors. One evening, as dusk settled over the plantation, she ventured too close to the hanging tree. When she returned, her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She spoke of seeing a woman standing beneath the oak, her dress stained with blood, her hands outstretched as if beckoning. Sarah said the woman's lips moved, but no sound came, only a low hum that seemed to vibrate in her bone. The girl's parents, frantic with worry, forbade her from leaving the house again, but Sarah was never the same. She began to suffer from nightmares so vivid she would wake screaming, her hands clawing at the air as if fending off an unseen attack. Within a year, the family left the plantation, driven away by Sarah's deteriorating health and their own growing fear that something was hunting them. The plantation's reputation began to spread beyond its borders, drawing the attention of neighboring communities. Families in nearby towns spoke of nightmares that plagued them, even miles away from the cursed land. Some described dreams of a woman with burning eyes, her voice whispering curses that lingered in their minds long after waking. Others saw visions of fields soaked in blood, of hands reaching up from the earth to drag them down. These dreams were so vivid, so consistent, that many began to believe the plantation's curse was not confined to its boundaries, that it could reach out and touch anyone who spoke its name too often or lingered too long in its shadow. By 1885, the plantation was all but abandoned. The last of the workers had fled, leaving behind tools, clothes and half-finished meals as if they had left in a hurry. The manor house stood empty, its doors creaking in the wind, its rooms filled with dust and the faint echo of those dragging chains. Yet the stories continued to grow, fed by the few brave or foolish souls who ventured onto the land. A traveling preacher, passing through in 1887, claimed he could exorcise the evil that clung to the plantation. He spent a single night in the manor house, armed with a Bible and a vial of holy water. The next morning, he was found wandering the fields, his eyes wild, his clothes torn, muttering about a darkness that swallowed the light. He left without explanation and was never seen in the region again. Local folklore began to weave a tapestry of explanations for the plantation's horrors. Some believed the land itself was cursed, poisoned by the blood and suffering of those who had toiled and died there. Others pointed to Maria's curse, claiming her spirit had bound itself to the earth, her rage too potent to fade with time. A few whispered of older, darker forces, things that had been on the land long before the Holloways arrived, entities that fed on pain and grew stronger with every act of cruelty committed on the plantation. These stories were told around hearths and in churchyards, passed from generation to generation, each retelling adding new details. A spectral hound that prowled the fields, its howls heralding death. A well near the slave quarters that bubbled with black water and whispered secrets to those who listened too closely. A shadow that moved against the wind, its form shifting between human and something else entirely. The plantation became a place of pilgrimage for the curious and the desperate. Spiritualists and mediums, drawn by tales of the supernatural, held séances in the manor house, hoping to commune with whatever lingered. Most left disappointed, their candles snuffed out by sudden gusts of wind, their spirit boards untouched. But a few claimed success, too much success. One medium, a woman named Madame Elise, described a vision of a woman with eyes like embers, her voice a hiss that spoke of betrayal and blood. The medium fled in the middle of the séance, her companions later reporting that she had scratched her own arms raw, as if trying to claw something out of her skin. Madame Elise never spoke of the plantation again, and within a year she was committed to an asylum, her mind shattered by what she had seen. By the end of the decade, Holloway Plantation was a place avoided by all but the most reckless. The fields remained untended, the manor house a decaying monument to a cursed legacy. Yet the stories persisted, growing wilder and more elaborate with each passing year. The shadowy figures, the wailing cries, the dragging chains and the ghost of Mariah beneath the hanging tree became part of the land's identity, inseparable from its history. For those who believed, the plantation was more than a place, it was a wound in the world, a tear through which something dark and hungry peered out, waiting for the next soul to claim. And as the years passed, it became clear that whatever haunted Holloway Plantation was not content to. It was waiting, watching, and growing stronger with every whisper of its name.
By the late 19th century, the Holloway family, once a pillar of wealth and influence in the region, had been reduced to a fractured lineage, their name synonymous with tragedy and dread. The plantation that had been their legacy was now a place of whispered curses and abandoned ruins, but the Holloways themselves could not escape the shadow it cast. Those who inherited the land, or even the name, seemed marked by a relentless fate, as if the curse that had taken root in the soil of Holloway Plantation had burrowed into their very blood. From suicides to inexplicable illnesses, from violent accidents to disappearances, the Holloway descendants bore the weight of their ancestors' sins, each generation falling to a darkness that seemed to stalk them relentlessly. The question that lingered in the minds of those who knew the stories was not whether the curse was real, but whether it could ever be outrun, or if the Holloway line was doomed to carry its burden until it was extinguished entirely. The first signs of the curse's grip on the family appeared soon after the plantation's decline. The Holloways, who had once lived in opulent splendor in the manor house, had scattered, their wealth depleted by mismanagement, legal battles and the land's refusal to yield crops after years of overuse and neglect. The eldest son of the last patriarch, Thomas Holloway, was a man named Jeremiah, who inherited the plantation in 1883 at the age of 32. Jeremiah was a somber figure, known for his sharp intellect and a stubborn determination to restore the family's fortune. He dismissed the tales of ghosts and curses as superstitious nonsense, believing that hard work and discipline could reclaim the land's productivity. But within a year of moving back to the plantation, his demeanor changed. Neighbors reported that Jeremiah, once a man of steady resolve, became withdrawn and paranoid. He spoke of hearing voices in the night, not the wailing cries described by others, but low, insistent murmurs that seemed to come from within the walls of the manor house. He claimed they spoke his name, accusing him of crimes he had not committed. In the spring of 1885, Jeremiah's body was found hanging from the ancient oak known as the Hanging Tree, the same tree where Mariah, the enslaved woman who had cursed a Holloway, had met her end decades earlier. The official report called it a suicide, but those who found him whispered of details that defied explanation. His face, they said, was frozen in a mask of terror, his eyes wide and staring as if he had seen something unspeakable in his final moments. The rope around his neck was frayed, as if it had been gnawed through, and the ground beneath the T was scorched in a perfect circle, though no fire had been reported. Jeremiah's death sent a chill through the remaining Holloways, and his younger sister Abigail refused to set foot on the plantation, selling her share of the inheritance to a distant cousin and fleeing to the city. But even there she was not safe. Within a year, Abigail fell ill with a wasting sickness that baffled doctors. She died in 1887,
her final days spent raving about a woman with burning eyes who stood at the foot of her bed, watching her. The pattern continued with grim predictability. The distant cousin who had purchased Abigail's share, a man named Cornelius Holloway, took up residence on the plantation in 1888, hoping to turn it into a profitable venture once more. Cornelius was a practical man, dismissive of the growing folklore surrounding the land. He brought with him his wife, Margaret, and their 2 young children, believing a fresh start would dispel the rumors and restore the family's name. But the plantation seemed to resist their effort. Crops withered despite fertile soil, tools broke inexplicably, and the livestock grew skittish, refusing to graze near the old slave quarters. Margaret, a devout woman, began holding nightly prayers, convinced that a spiritual malaise hung over the land. She spoke of dreams in which she saw a woman in white, her hands bound in chains, standing in the fields and pointing at the manor house. The dreams grew so vivid that Margaret began to sleep with a cross clutched to her chest, but it did little to ease her growing dread. In the winter of 1890, tragedy struck again. Cornelius was killed in a freak accident when a plow blade, left unattended in the barn, fell from its mount and struck him in the chest. The wound was deep and precise, almost surgical, though no one could explain how the heavy blade had come loose. Margaret, devastated by her husband's death, took the children and left the plantation, vowing never to return. But the curse seemed to follow them. The eldest child, a boy named Samuel, drowned in a river near their new home in 1892. His body found tangled in weeds that locals swore had not been there the day before. The younger child, a girl named Eliza, survived into adulthood but was plagued by visions and seizures that left her bedridden for months at a time. She died in 1905, whispering about a shadow that followed her, its breath cold against her neck. By the turn of the century, the Holloway name was spoken with a mix of pity and fear. The few remaining descendants avoided the plantation, but distance did little to shield them. A second cousin, William Holloway, who had never even visited the land, was found dead in his Charleston home in 1908, his body covered in strange circular burns that defied medical explanation. His wife claimed he had been obsessed with family records in the weeks before his death, poring over old letters that mentioned a debt unpaid and a reckoning to come. Another relative, a woman named Beatrice, vanished while traveling through the region. Her belongings were found near the plantation's boundaries, scattered as if she had been running from something. No trace of her was ever found, though locals claimed to hear her screams echoing through the fields on moonless nights. The last direct heir to the Holloway fortune was Eleanor Holloway, a solitary figure born in 1895 to a distant branch of the family. Eleanor was a woman of fierce independence, educated and skeptical, with no patience for the ghost stories that clung to her family's name. When she inherited the plantation in 1919, she saw it as an opportunity to break the cycle of fear and failure. She moved into the manor house alone, determined to uncover the truth behind the family's misfortunes and put an end to the rumor. Eleanor was meticulous, keeping a journal of her observations and combing through the plantation's records for clues. She found references to Mariah's curse in old family letters, as well as cryptic mentions of rituals performed by the enslaved workers to appease the old ones, who watched over the land. Intrigued but unconvinced, Eleanor dismissed these as folklore until the night she heard the chain. The sound came from the cellar, a slow rhythmic dragging that grew louder as she approached. Armed with a lantern, Eleanor descended into the damp earthen space, only to find it empty, the dirt floor unmarked. But the air was thick with a cold that seeped into her bones, and she felt a presence so oppressive it made her chest ache. From that night on, Eleanor's journal entries grew erratic, filled with descriptions of shadows that moved without light, whispers that called her name, and a growing certainty that something was watching her. She wrote of the hanging tree, where she saw a figure in white, its eyes burning with a fury that seemed to pierce her soul. "It knows me," she wrote in her final entry. "It knows what we did." On a stormy night in 1923, the manor house went up in flames. Neighbors saw the blaze from miles away, a towering inferno that consumed the decaying structure in hours. Eleanor was never found, though some claimed to see a figure standing in the fields as the house burned, unmoving against the backdrop of fire. The official report called it an accident, possibly caused by a lantern left unattended, but those who knew the stories believed Eleanor had set the fire deliberately, hoping to destroy whatever haunted the land. Others whispered a darker possibility, that the curse had claimed her, pulling her into the same darkness that had taken her kin. The destruction of the manor house marked the end of the Holloway line, but not the end of the story. Some said Eleanor's act had weakened the curse, scattering its power like ash on the wind. Others believed she had only angered it, giving it new strength to reach beyond the plantation's borders. The Holloways were gone, their name reduced to a cautionary tale, but the land remained, its secrets buried deep in the soil. For those who dared to speak of it, the question lingered: was the curse bound to the bloodline, or had it always been rooted in the earth itself, waiting for the next soul to claim? As the years passed, the plantation's ruins stood as a testament to a family undone by their own history, a warning that some debts can never be paid, and some burdens can never be shed.
The ruins of Holloway Plantation lay silent for decades, a forgotten scar on the landscape, overgrown with kudzu and brambles that seemed to guard its secrets with thorny vigilance. By the late 20th century, the land was little more than a curiosity for local historians and thrill-seekers, its dark history reduced to half-remembered tales told in hushed tones. But in 1998, a team of archaeologists from a nearby university arrived to survey the site, drawn by its historical significance and the persistent rumors of its cursed past. What they uncovered beneath the fields would reignite the plantation's legend, revealing truths that had been buried for generations, and stirring forces that some believed should have remained undisturbed. The archaeological dig began in the spring, focusing on the area near the old slave quarters, a cluster of crumbling foundations and rotting timbers that had once housed the enslaved workers who toiled under the Holloway regime. The team, led by Dr. Evelyn Carter, a historian with a reputation for uncovering forgotten narratives, expected to find artifacts typical of 19th century plantations, tools, pottery shards, perhaps remnants of daily life. Instead, they unearthed something far more unsettling. Beneath a patch of earth that refused to grow anything but sparse, sickly grass, they discovered a mass grave, its existence unrecorded in any official documents. The pit contained the remains of at least 24 individuals, their bones tangled together in a chaotic jumble, as if they had been hastily buried without care or ceremony. The skeletons bore signs of violence, fractured skulls, broken limbs, and in some cases deep gashes that suggested blade wounds. Among the remains were rusted iron shackles, their chains still coiled around brittle wrists and ankles, and strange talismans carved from bone and wood, etched with symbols that defied immediate interpretation. The discovery sent a ripple of unease through the team. Carter, a woman grounded in science, initially dismissed the local legends as folklore, but the talismans troubled her. They were unlike anything she had seen in her years of studying Southern history. Intricate, almost ritualistic, with patterns that hinted at a blend of African spiritual traditions and something older, less familiar. She sent them to a colleague for analysis, but the colleague's report was inconclusive, noting only that the symbols bore no clear resemblance to known cultural artifacts from the region. The shackles, too, were an anomaly. While slave irons were not uncommon, these were unusually heavy, their surfaces pitted with corrosion but marked with faint engravings, names or perhaps words in a language no one could identify. The team photographed and catalogued the findings, but as they worked they began to notice an oppressive atmosphere settling over the site. Tools went missing, only to reappear in places no one had touched. Footprints appeared in the dirt overnight, though the site was secured and guarded. One graduate student, a young man named Daniel, reported hearing a low hum emanating from the ground near the grave, a sound that made his teeth ache and his skin crawl. The dig took a stranger turn when the team moved to the overseer's house, a sagging structure that had somehow survived the 1923 fire that destroyed the main manor. Beneath the floorboards, hidden in a hollowed-out section of the foundation, they found a leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed but remarkably preserved. The diary belonged to Silas Reed, an overseer employed by the Holloways in the 1850s, during the plantation's final years of operation. Its entries began mundanely, detailing crop yields and labor disputes, but grew increasingly frantic over time. Silas wrote of something that walked the halls at night, a presence that moved without sound yet left behind a trail of cold air and the faint scent of decay. He described hearing whispers that seemed to come from within his own mind, calling out names not his own but those of the enslaved workers, many of whom had died under his watch. One entry, dated just weeks before the plantation's collapse, read, "It knows what we did. It sees us in the dark. The chains are not enough to hold it." The final pages were illegible,
smeared with ink and what appeared to be dried blood. The diary's discovery intensified the unease among the team. Dr. Carter, though skeptical, could not ignore the growing sense that their work was being watched. Equipment began to fail without explanation. Cameras refused to focus, metal detectors emitted erratic beeps, and battery-powered tools drained within minutes, despite being fully charged. One night, a generator caught fire, its flames burning an unnatural shade of green before being extinguished. The team's photographer, a woman named Lila, captured images of the site that showed strange anomalies, faint, humanoid shapes in the background of otherwise clear shots, and orbs of light that hovered over the mass grave. Lila, shaken, refused to return to the site, claiming she felt a pressure on her chest whenever she stood near the slave quarters, as if something were trying to force its way into her lungs. By the early 2000s, the plantation had attracted the attention of paranormal investigators, drawn by the archaeological findings and the site's grim reputation. A team from a television show called Beyond the Veil arrived in 2003, equipped with infrared cameras, electromagnetic field detectors and audio recorders. They set up camp in the ruins of the overseer's house, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. From the outset, their investigation was plagued by issues. Their equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, with batteries dying and screens flickering with static. Audio recordings picked up faint, unintelligible whispers, punctuated by sudden bursts of sound that resembled chains dragging across stone. One investigator, a seasoned skeptic named Mark, reported a sudden drop in temperature in the old slave quarters, the air growing so cold that his breath fogged despite the humid summer night. He described an overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling that something was standing just behind him, its presence heavy and malevolent. The team left after only 2 nights, their footage inconclusive but their nerves frayed. Mark later admitted in an interview that he had never felt such raw fear in his life, a fear that lingered long after he left the plantation. Local residents, many of whom had grown up with stories of the plantation's curse, were unsurprised by the investigators' experience. They spoke of the land as a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where the pain of the past had left a permanent mark. Some believed the mass grave was the key, that the bodies buried there were not just victims of the plantation's brutality, but part of a ritual gone wrong, a desperate attempt to bind or appease whatever had haunted the land. Others pointed to the talismans, suggesting they were protective charms that had failed to hold back a force older than the plantation itself. A few elders in the community, descendants of the enslaved, whispered of oral traditions that spoke of the old ones, spirits or entities tied to the earth, awakened by the bloodshed and suffering of the Holloway era. These stories were vague, their details lost to time, but they carried a common thread. The land was not merely cursed, it was alive, and it remembered. In the years following the dig, the plantation became a magnet for amateur ghost hunters and urban explorers. Despite warnings from locals to stay away, many reported similar experiences: sudden chills, unexplained sounds, and a pervasive sense of being watched. One group exploring the site in 2007 claimed to have seen a figure in white standing beneath the hanging tree, its eyes glowing with a fire that seemed to burn through the darkness. They fled, leaving behind a camera that later revealed a single blurry image of a woman's face, her features distorted as if screaming. The image was widely shared online, fueling speculation and drawing more visitors to the site, though few stayed long. The land seemed to repel them, its atmosphere heavy with a malice that no one could fully explain. The discoveries of 1998 and the investigations that followed only deepened the mystery of Holloway Plantation. The mass grave, the talismans, the diary, and the paranormal activity all pointed to a history far darker than anyone had imagined. For Dr. Carter and her team, the findings were a sobering reminder of the human cost of the plantation's past, a cost that seemed to echo into the present. For the paranormal investigators, it was evidence of something beyond the natural world, a force that defied science and reason. And for the locals, it was confirmation of what they had always known, that the plantation was a place of pain, its secrets buried not just in the earth, but in the very air, waiting to be uncovered by those foolish enough to dig too deep. As the new century dawned, the question remained: what lay beneath the fields of Holloway Plantation, and would it ever allow itself to be forgotten?
Holloway Plantation, now little more than a skeleton of its former grandeur, stands as a monument to a past that refuses to be forgotten.
The once sprawling estate, with its fields of cotton and tobacco and its imposing manor house, has been reduced to crumbling foundations, overgrown with vines that seem to strangle the ruins in a possessive embrace. The air hangs heavy with the weight of history, and the stories that cling to the land have grown into a tapestry of fear, sorrow, and unanswered questions. In the early 21st century, as the world moves forward with its relentless march of progress, the plantation remains a place apart, a wound in the earth that festers with the pain of those who suffered there. The legacy of the Holloways, their cursed bloodline, and the horrors unearthed beneath the fields continue to haunt the collective imagination, raising questions about the nature of evil, the permanence of curses, and whether some sins can ever be absolved. The plantation's story, pieced together from historical records, oral traditions, and the chilling discoveries of 1998, paints a picture of a place where human cruelty left an indelible mark. The mass grave near the slave quarters, the strange talismans, and the overseer's diary all point to a history of violence and desperation, a cycle of oppression that seemed to awaken, or perhaps summon something beyond the realm of the living. The tales of Mariah, the enslaved woman whose curse is said to have doomed the Holloway family, remain central to the plantation's lore. Her story, passed down through generations, is one of defiance and retribution, a reminder that the enslaved were not passive victims, but individuals who fought back, even if their weapons were words and rituals rather than swords. Yet as the years have passed, the question persists: was the curse truly Mariah's doing, or was it a manifestation of something older, something tied to the land itself, fed by the blood and tears spilled across its field? Today, the plantation is a place of pilgrimage for a new generation of seekers, historians, paranormal enthusiasts, and those drawn by the allure of the unknown. The ruins are off limits, cordoned off by local authorities after too many trespassers reported unsettling experiences, but the stories continue to spread. Online forums buzz with accounts of unexplained phenomena, visitors who felt an icy hand on their shoulder, photographs that captured fleeting shadows, and dreams that lingered long after leaving the site. Some claim the curse is still active, feeding on the pain embedded in the soil, growing stronger with each retelling of the plantation's horrors. Others argue that the curse was never about the land at all but about the Holloways themselves, a family doomed by the sins of their ancestors, their bloodline carrying the weight of guilt and retribution, until it was extinguished with Eleanor Holloway's disappearance. The local community, many of whom are descendants of those who lived and worked on the plantation, holds a complex relationship with its legacy. For some, the site is a reminder of resilience, a testament to the strength of those who survived unimaginable hardship. Elders in the community speak of their ancestors' stories, passed down through whispered tales around kitchen tables, of spirits who guard the land, protecting it from those who would exploit it further. They view the talismans found in the mass grave not as objects of fear but as symbols of resistance, crafted by the enslaved to ward off the evil they sensed in the Holloway's rule. Yet even these elders warn against lingering too long near the plantation, speaking of a presence that watches, waiting for those who disturb its rest. The land remembers. One woman, a great-granddaughter of an enslaved worker, said in "It don't forget and it don't forgive." The plantation's influence extends beyond its physical boundaries, seeping into the cultural consciousness of the region. It has inspired books, documentaries, and even a low-budget horror film that sensationalized the curse but captured the eerie atmosphere of the ruin. Local schools teach about the plantation as part of the region's history, though teachers tread carefully, aware of the pain it represents for many families. The site has also become a case study for scholars of African American history, who see in its story a microcosm of the broader legacy of slavery, a system that not only brutalized bodies, but left scars on the land and the collective psyche. Evelyn Carter, the archaeologist who led the 1998 dig, published a book in 2005 titled Beneath the Soil: The Hidden History of Holloway Plantation, which argues that the plantation's horrors are not supernatural but deeply human, rooted in the unacknowledged trauma of those who were enslaved. Yet even she admits, in private conversations, that the site's atmosphere defies rational explanation, a feeling of dread that lingers like a stain. Paranormal investigators continue to be drawn to the plantation, though few stay long. The 2018 investigation by a group called Spectral South recorded what they claimed was the clearest evidence yet of supernatural activity, an audio clip of a woman's voice, faint but unmistakable, whispering. The recording, shared widely online, reignited interest in the site, but it also sparked debate. Skeptics dismissed it as wind or interference, while believers saw it as proof of Mariah's lingering presence, her curse still demanding payment. The investigators themselves were divided, with one member refusing to return after experiencing what she described as a vision of a woman in white, her eyes burning with accusation, standing beneath the hanging tree. The tree itself, gnarled and ancient, remains a focal point of the plantation's lore, its branches still standing despite storms and time, as if rooted in something deeper than the earth. The question of whether the curse can ever be broken remains unanswered. Some believe that Eleanor Holloway's act of burning the manor house in 1923 was a desperate attempt to sever the curse's hold, a sacrifice that scattered its power but did not destroy it. Others argue that the curse is not a single entity, but a collective weight, the accumulated pain of countless lives lost to the plantation's brutality. For them, breaking the curse would require more than fire or ritual. It would demand acknowledgement, reconciliation, and a reckoning with the past. Community leaders have proposed turning the site into a memorial, a place to honor the enslaved and educate future generations, but funding and local politics have stalled the effort. The land remains untouched, its ruins a silent witness to a history that refuses to fade. As the 21st century unfolds, Holloway Plantation stands as a paradox, a place both forgotten and unforgettable, a relic of a past that continues to shape the present. Its stories, whether rooted in truth or woven from fear, have taken on a life of their own, a legacy that outlives the Holloways and their ill-fated lineage. The land itself seems to resist healing, its soil barren, its air thick with an unease that defies explanation. For some, the plantation is a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil once sown can take root in ways that endure beyond lifetimes. For others, it is a call to remember, to bear witness to the voices that still whisper beneath the feet. The question that haunts those who know the story is not just whether the curse can be broken, but whether some evils are so profound, so tied to the earth, that they will wait forever for the next soul to awaken them. As the ruins crumble and the stories persist, Holloway Plantation remains a place where the past is never truly past, and the future is shadowed by what lies buried beneath.
The tale of Holloway Plantation is a haunting journey through a history steeped in pain, mystery, and the unyielding grip of the past. From the shadowy figures stalking the fields to the tragic fates of the Holloway descendants, the story weaves together human cruelty, supernatural dread, and the enduring question of whether some wounds can ever heal. What strikes me most is how the plantation's legacy lingers, not just in its ruins, but in the way it forces us confront the consequences of our actions, the weight of unacknowledged sins, and the power of stories to keep the dead alive. Is the curse real? Or is it a manifestation of collective guilt, a mirror held up to a society that built its wealth on suffering? The ambiguity is what makes this tale so compelling, leaving us to wonder if the land itself remembers, or if we, in telling its story, keep its ghosts awake. What do you think of the Holloway Plantation saga? Do you believe the curse is bound to the land, the family, or something deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take on this eerie tale. If you enjoyed diving into this chilling piece of history, consider subscribing for more stories that explore the shadows of the past. Your support keeps these tales alive, and I can't wait to uncover more mysteries with you.